Night fell heavy over Garrowfield Keep, as though the sky itself wore mourning cloth. Torches guttered in the courtyard, their flames nervous in the wind. Around them gathered the lords of the north, stern men in layered steel, bearing the scars of a dozen winters. Their banners snapped sharply, like reprimands against the cold. Sir Aldrin stood among them, hands clasped behind his back, helmet tucked beneath his arm. His face looked carved more than grown, lines dug into his brow as if hardship had chiseled him. He watched the last soldiers trickle in through the gate, mud caked up to their knees, eyes sunken from sleepless nights of anticipation. War had a scent. He could smell it tonight. Steel, sweat, horses, fear. Inside the great hall, the lords convened in grim silence. The chamber was lit by tallow candles that sputtered and dripped like melting bones. At the head of the table stood Lord Brindle, the aging warden of the north. His voice was hoarse, worn by years and bitter memory. The relic must be reclaimed. Our fathers swore to protect it, and instead, his voice cracked with fury. Instead, we let the southern kingdom steal it from our churches while we watched. Murmurs rippled. Resentment simmered. Sir Aldrin kept his expression stiff, though inside, a thought smoldered. We did not watch. We simply lacked the strength to stop them. The priests entered then, heads bowed, robes dragging across stone. They placed before the lords an iron standard, corroded, ancient, revered. Its weight was not measured in metal, but history. Lord Brindle touched it reverently, and the hall fell to stillness. "Tonight," he said, voice trembling, "we swear our oath anew." Each lord placed his gauntleted hand upon the standard. Sir Aldrin followed last. The cold of the metal bit his skin through the glove. It felt like judgment. In that moment, he remembered the fields of Turvane, where he watched men drown in blood mud. He remembered pushing wounded comrades off the road to make room for more wagons. He remembered the faces of dying squires who still apologized for failing him. He wondered how many more such memories this oath would carve into him, but honor had no patience for hesitation. "I swear," Aldrin said softly. His voice nearly failed him. The priest sealed the promise in scripture, invoked heaven and hell, and then the ceremony was done. The campaign was set. Outside, the soldiers prepared for departure. Horses snorted clouds into the frigid air. Armor was strapped, shields were stacked. Archers checked their bowstrings by torchlight as snow began to drift lazily down. Aldrin walked the rows of young men, shivering, eager, naive. Many would never see their homes again. A boy approached him, no more than 17, helm crooked on his head. "Sir Aldrin, is it true the southern kingdoms fear us?" Aldrin studied him. He saw hope burning like dry straw. "They will," he lied gently. The boy beamed. Across the courtyard, Aldrin saw Lady Talia, Brindle's daughter, overseeing the quartermasters. Her eyes met Aldrin's for a moment, sharp, knowing, worried. She understood the grim underside of war. She always had. "Is this truly necessary?" she asked when Aldrin drew near. "For our honor," he said. "For the priest's honor," she corrected. "For the realm," he amended. She exhaled, defeated. "Bring the men home, Aldrin, as many as you can." He wished he could promise that. Instead, he nodded once. At dawn, the trumpets called. The gates opened. The first rays of morning bled over the horizon like the beginning of a wound. Lord Brindle rode at the front, standard raised high. Behind him, the knights marched in solemn procession, armor grinding, cloaks dragging frost, hooves pounding frozen earth. Sir Aldrin led his battalion forward, eyes forward, jaw clenched. The people watched from the walls in silence. Some prayed, some wept. Aldrin did not look back. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the road to foreign lands, enemy kingdoms, jagged mountains, unknowable horrors. A campaign baptized in pride, wrapped in desperation. He knew 3 truths already. They were not prepared. They lacked supplies, and glory would not save them. But honor was a chain, and it pulled him into the unknown. The banners of the North faded into white distance as the gates closed behind them, and the long march began. The first days on the open road offered little comfort. The path wound southward through fields long stripped bare by winter. Frost clung to dry stalks of harvested grain like ghosts refusing to leave. The wind carried the smell of soil and cold iron, and every hoof-fall echoed the cost of this decision. The army stretched for miles, a living serpent of steel and leather, thousands of feet stamping the ground into frozen ruts. Wagons creaked under the weight of supplies. Horses faltered from the uneven terrain. Hunters scouted and returned empty-handed more often than not. There were already problems. Aldrin noted every one. The rations had been packed poorly. The dried meat was salt-burned and brittle. The flour was damp, infested in some sacks. Some soldiers whispered that the priests sent their faith and forgot the bread. The commanders feigned ignorance. Aldrin saw truth grimly and quietly. On the 4th day, it rained. Not a cleansing rain, no. A cold, miserable drizzle that chilled bone and soaked cloaks. A rain that turned the earth to black, sucking mud. Horses stumbled in it, struggling to pull the wagons. Wheels sank deep. Men were ordered to push with bare hands, cursing the clinging muck as it swallowed boots. The youngest soldiers, untested by hardship, complained bitterly. Sir Aldrin endured in silence. He had crossed worse roads. He knew the campaign was truly beginning, and the land itself was eager to bury them. One evening, Aldrin found Lord Brindle in his command tent, hunched over maps lit by a single flickering lantern. The old man's hands trembled slightly, not from age, Aldrin knew, but anticipation. Fearful anticipation. "How far to the borderlands?" Aldrin asked quietly. 3 days, Brindle replied tiredly, "if the weather holds." It would not hold, Aldrin knew, by the wet smell of the wind. The men are restless. Food spoils, morale weakens. Brindle's jaw tightened. War is not won by comfort. No, Aldrin agreed, but often lost by neglect. The words were honest, perhaps too honest. Brindle's eyes narrowed, his pride bristled. "See to your battalion, Sir Aldrin. I will see to the realm." Aldrin inclined his head and left. There was no point in arguing, not yet. That night the soldiers slept poorly. The rain beat against canvas like relentless drumming. Some tents leaked, others collapsed under the weight of soaked cloth. Fires sputtered and died, leaving many to shiver through the night. Aldrin walked the camp, cloak pulled tight, boots sinking softly into mud. He checked on young levies, soothed frightened boys, helped raise tents, corrected guard rotations himself. His men trusted him because he shared their suffering. At the camp perimeter, he saw the first signs of sickness, soldiers coughing, their cheeks pale, eyes glazed. The healers lacked herbs, too few, too precious. Aldrin clenched his teeth. The campaign had barely begun, and already it was chipping away at them, slowly, quietly, mercilessly. War was not only won or lost on the battlefield. It lived in each night of exhaustion, each meal that failed to nourish, each wound left half-treated. When dawn came, the rain stopped, but in its place came a merciless cold. Frost hardened the mud into jagged surfaces that cut boots and tore flesh. Horses bled at the hoofs. Some could not walk further and were slaughtered early to spare their suffering. Their meat was roasted and rationed. For many soldiers, it was the best meal they'd had in days. Aldrin observed the eating silently, hands clasped behind his back, hunger dull in his own belly. He saw the desperation already settling into the men's faces. They had expected adventure, glory, stories to tell. Instead, rain, mud, exhaustion, and blood. The campaign stripped illusions swiftly. By the time they reached the borderlands, few illusions remained, and fewer comforts. The road would only grow darker from here. Worse roads, harsher lands, deeper wounds. And none yet understood the true cost. But Aldrin did, and it gnawed him hollow. The land changed slowly as they approached the border, first in texture, then in silence. Gone were the farm fields, gone the lonely windmills and scattered villages. Before them stretched a vast, empty expanse of frost-bitten earth and skeletal trees, where even crows seemed reluctant to linger. This was the no man's land, a scar left by centuries of conflict between kingdoms, burned and abandoned so many times that nothing living trusted it anymore. The soldiers lowered their voices instinctively. Even laughter here felt like a trespass. The first abandoned village appeared by midday. Smoke-black ruins, collapsed thatch roofs, charred beams jutting like ribs from the ground. No bodies remained, but absence was not comforting. Aldrin dismounted and walked among the remains. Snow drifted softly across the hearths that once held warmth. A child's wooden horse lay half-buried in mud. He touched it and felt only the cold of things lost too long. "Sir Aldrin," one of his captains whispered, "do you think the villagers fled south?" Aldrin studied the blackened walls. "No," he replied quietly. "They died here." The captain swallowed and said nothing more. The army marched on. 2 days into the borderlands, the raids began. At dusk, arrows hissed from the tree line, striking 2 men before anyone could react. War cries echoed, a harsh, unfamiliar tongue. Raiders burst from the shadows like wolves, leather-clad, desperate, scraping survival from blood. But there was no organized army behind these attacks, only starving men, armed with rusted steel and broken hope. The knights fought them back quickly, brutally. Steel rang sharply against bone. Mud splashed red in the fading light. Aldrin cut down one raider who was scarcely older than 15. He wished he had missed. Afterward, the soldiers rummaged through the raiders' belongings, hoping to find supplies. They found none. Not a grain of wheat. Not a crumb of bread. Only hunger. Hunger stronger than fear. That night, the wounded groaned in the dark, tended with rough hands and too few bandages. The firelight flickered across Aldrin as he cleaned the blood from his sword with a torn scrap of cloth. Lord Brindell approached him. "They attacked us without provocation," Brindell growled. "Savages, thieves. We are right to march south." Aldrin paused, eyes fixed on the weapon in his hands. "They attacked because they starve," he said. Brindell scoffed. "Compassion will not win us battles." "No," Aldrin said softly. "But neither will ignorance." Brindell walked away, annoyed. The priests prayed loudly at the center of camp, trying to drown the wounded's cries with scripture. But the cries broke through every verse. By the 6th day, the borderlands claimed their first large toll.
30 wagons were abandoned when their wheels shattered on jagged frozen soil. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Men began to faint from hunger and exposure. The healers ran out of herbs. They rationed lantern oil, then water. Some soldiers drank melted snow directly from their helmets. At night, wolves circled just beyond the perimeter torches, silent shadows with patient hunger. Their eyes glowed like embers, waiting for weakness. It would not be long. On the 7th night, Aldrin found the youngest squire of his battalion, Marin, shivering beside a dying fire. "Haven't slept?" Aldrin asked. Marin rubbed his eyes with trembling fingers. "Every time I close them, sir," he whispered, "I hear screaming, even when no one is screaming." Aldrin sat beside him. "That is war," he said. Marin swallowed hard. "Does it get easier?" A long silence. "No," Aldrin answered. There was no comfort in truth, but lies were worse. When they finally reached the far edge of the borderlands, the army numbered fewer than when it entered. Not because of battle, but the land itself. Sunken wagons, frozen lungs, broken spirits. The priest still spoke of divine purpose. The Lord still spoke of glory. But the men did not. They spoke only of water, warmth, and home. And ahead, looming like a wall between kingdoms, the mountains waited, silent, unmoved, unforgiving.
The mountains rose like jagged teeth at the horizon, stabbing the clouds. Their slopes were coated in sheets of ice and deep snow that hid every path like a secret deliberately buried. No map could be trusted here. No guide had survived long enough to become expert. If the borderlands had been bleak, the mountains were merciless. On the first descent, men collapsed under the strain of hauling wagons up inclines too steep for wheels. Horses slipped, hooves scraping desperately against frozen stone. 2 were lost before noon, one tumbling down a ravine with a scream that seemed to echo forever. The entire army paused to listen, not out of mourning, but fear. If a horse could fall, so could they. The wind was not merely cold, it was violent, cruel. Skin numbed beneath armor, fingers stiffened, water froze in flasks. The men huddled together at night, sharing their breath, trying to ward off death sleep, the final cold from which one did not wake. Aldrin walked the camp at night, forcing himself to remain awake. If he allowed exhaustion to claim him, his men would lose what hope they still clung to. The mountains stole warmth, stole rest, stole sanity. By the 4th night, the first men deserted. They took no horses, no supplies. They simply vanished into the frozen dark. Brindle ordered torches lit and sent search parties. Aldrin knew it was pointless. The mountains did not give back what they took. The search returned with only frozen footprints that ended abruptly at a cliff edge. The priests interpreted this as judgment. Aldrin interpreted it as tragedy. Then came the avalanche, triggered by nothing more than sound, or perhaps by the mountains simply deciding to punish them. The roar started faintly, a distant rumble like thunder under the earth. Then the world shook. Snow exploded from the heights, cascading downward in a tidal wave of ice and death. Men ran, shouted, cursed the gods, but there was no outrunning nature. 1,000 tons of white descended upon them. Aldrin watched, powerless, as men he knew, men he trained, were swallowed whole, screams crushed by the weight of the world. When silence returned, it was horrifying. 30 soldiers buried. Only 3 bodies recovered. The rest vanished beneath the snow. Brindle declared the fallen heroes. Aldrin could not bring himself to speak. Food dwindled faster than hope. Hunting parties returned empty-handed. Even the wolves seemed absent now, as if they knew better than to follow the dying into the mountains. The men boiled leather from spare straps, softened it with snow, and chewed methodically, desperately, pretending it offered nutrition. Their stomachs argued otherwise. Snow blindness became epidemic. White glare reflecting off the slopes stripped sight from men's eyes until they stumbled, disoriented, terrified, clutching at air or comrades. Aldrin lost 1 squire to blindness on the 5th day. The boy did not complain. He simply apologized, over and over, as though shame were worse than death. When they finally crested the highest ridge, battered and starving, frostbitten and hollow-eyed, they looked down upon the valley beyond. The path did not descend into safety. It descended into more rock, more wind, more snow. Aldrin's heart clenched. There was no relief waiting on the far side, only more hardship. The mountains were not merely geography. They were judgment, test, torment, trial, and they were only halfway through. That night, by the dim glow of one dying campfire, Aldrin whispered quietly to himself, "We have already lost." And though no one heard him, the mountains did, and they agreed.
The Valley of Heartfall was not a valley in truth, but a trap disguised as one. The land dipped gently between 2 ridges, and at the far end stood the crumbling stone watch fort the scouts had sworn was abandoned. Its broken towers sagged like a corpse refusing burial. The gate was shattered, the banners long gone, the inner yard strewn with snowdrifts. It looked empty, quiet, forgotten. Even Aldrin believed it, for one fatal moment. Lord Brindle rode ahead with the cavalry, declaring that victory waited within those ruined walls. The priests crossed themselves, singing praises as if their triumph was ordained. Aldrin remained uneasy. Something in the silence was wrong. Not a bird, not a breath of wind, just cold stone, watching. The men marched forward anyway. Orders were orders. The ambush sprang like a snare. The first volley struck from the cliffs above, dozens of arrows raining down with horrifying precision. Horses reared and screamed, men toppled sideways, pierced through helm or throat before they even understood. Then the gates of the fort burst outward. Enemies surged forth in disciplined ranks, shields interlocked, spears thrusting, silent and relentless. The garrison Brindle believed gone had been waiting, watching, waiting for arrogance, waiting for them. Chaos consumed the valley. The northern knights tried to form lines, but mud sucked at boots and loose snow hid uneven ground. Commanders shouted contradictory orders. Trumpets blared, then were cut short by blades. Aldrin rallied his battalion by instinct alone. "Shields up! Hold your ground!" They formed a wall, bracing under the storm of spears. Men screamed as iron struck flesh, as comrades fell, as shields splintered. The enemy pressed them hard. Harder than any borderland raiders. Harder than starvation. Harder than the mountains. This was a real army. Prepared. Patient. Precise. Aldrin forced his way toward Lord Brindle through the melee, sword dripping, armor dented.
He found him surrounded, bewildered, his warhorse collapsing beneath him with an arrow through its heart. Brindle fell into the mud, breath knocked from him, helmet rolling away like a discarded crown. Aldrin seized him, dragging him backward as spears stabbed around them. "We must retreat," Aldrin shouted back. "We will be buried here if we don't flee." For a heartbeat, Brindle stared at him. Then another volley shrieked overhead, and pride finally cracked. "Signal retreat," he whispered, with despair, not command. The trumpet sounded, shrill, broken, hollow. The call of failure, the call of death left behind. Armored men stumbled back up the valley, dragging wounded comrades, dropping shields to run faster. Horses bucked and bolted riderless. The enemy pursued relentlessly, cutting down stragglers mercilessly. There was no dignity to the retreat. Only survival. Barely that. Hours later, long after night had fallen, the mangled army regrouped in a ravine far from Heartfall. Dozens were missing. Hundreds wounded. Supplies lost. Weapons gone. Horses dead. Campfires sputtered weakly across the snow, illuminating the broken remnants of what had marched with confidence only weeks before. Aldrin sat, armor half removed, hands shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from fury, from grief, from truth. The priests called the defeat a divine test. Brindle called it a tactical misfortune. Aldrin called it what it was: catastrophe, avoidable, predictable, preventable, and the beginning of something worse. Late that night, as he walked the rows of wounded men, he realized something painful. This campaign would not deliver glory. It would deliver graves. And there would not be enough earth to cover them all.
After Heartfall, the army limped into a shallow hollow surrounded by jagged hills. The first snows of winter had arrived, thickening by the hour. The ground was already frozen to stone, and the night sank quickly into unbearable cold. The men shivered under tattered cloaks, smoke from feeble fires curling skyward, fragile and insubstantial. It was a camp built from despair. The wounded were prioritized, but there were too many. Amputations became common, hands, toes, fingers, performed by clerics and healers with little more than a rusty saw and prayer. Frostbite spread faster than infection, and many chose to let their suffering end rather than endure another night. Aldrin moved among them silently, examining ragged troops, offering whispered encouragement. Many didn't respond. Many were too far gone. Some had already left the world behind, lying with frozen eyes open toward indifferent stars. Food ran thinner than hope. Meat was scavenged from dead horses. Grain was soaked in snow to soften it. The priests blessed it. No one cared. By the third day, soldiers fought over scraps. The strongest men hoarded what they could. The weak, those who could not stand or walk, begged silently and were denied. Hunger made monsters of them, men they had once called comrades. Aldrin found himself staring into faces that could barely meet his own, eyes hollow, lips blue, cheeks sunken. Some had begun to whisper names of family long dead or distant, as if repeating them could summon salvation. It could not. Morale crumbled further with the wind. It shrieked through the tents, tearing canvas like paper. Snow piled against walls, fires were smothered. Some men went mad, wandering into the storm, calling for mothers or praying to gods that had abandoned them. Wolves circled near, keenly aware of desperation, but had yet to strike. Even they waited, patient, knowing the men were breaking themselves. The priests organized mass prayers at dawn and dusk. Their chants echoed hollowly over the hollowed men. Aldrin watched, trying to understand their faith, but only felt a growing emptiness. He had prayed before, silently, alone,
But now, amidst the suffering, the words tasted bitter in his mouth. By the 5th day, Brindle's temper had grown brittle. Orders were shouted, contradicting themselves. Officers fought over resources, each believing their men deserved what little remained more than anyone else. Discipline waned. Soldiers refused to march in formation. Some even threatened their superiors. Aldrin intervened when he could, rallying his small battalion to maintain cohesion. It was a struggle against entropy itself, against starvation, cold, exhaustion, fear. On the 6th night, a man fell from a tent, shouting in delirium. His companions attempted to restrain him. He struck one with a boot, knocked another unconscious, then bolted into the storm. Aldrin watched him disappear into the snow. Later, only a small trail of tracks remained, ending abruptly at the edge of a frozen creek. He did not survive. The encampment lasted 3 weeks. Plague arrived silently, carried by the weakened and the wounded. Coughs, fever, swelling pustules, infected wounds. There were no herbs left, no medicines, only crude treatment, prayer, and acceptance. By the time the army broke camp, the survivors numbered barely half of those who had left Garrowfield, and the mountains loomed again ahead, taller than before, colder, merciless. The winter encampment had stripped them of much more than strength. It had stripped their illusions. Aldrin stood at the edge of camp, staring toward the jagged peaks. The wind tore at his face, biting, unrelenting. He thought of the boys he had trained, the men he had ridden with. He thought of the prayers that had gone unanswered. He thought of the long road ahead, and a single truth sank into him like ice in the marrow of his bones. The worst was yet to come.
The plateau stretched endlessly, a barren expanse of gray stone and windswept snow. There were no trees, no villages, no animals. Only the faint outline of the mountains they had survived and the distant horizon, blurred by frost and exhaustion. The men marched in silence, not the silence of peace, but of survival. Their boots scuffed frozen gravel, dragging through patches of snow, echoing hollowly across the empty landscape. Every footstep was a small rebellion against the void that threatened to consume them. Food and water had dwindled to near nothing. Soldiers gnawed at leather belts, chewed on old boots softened in boiling water. Some drank melted snow, their tongues raw, throats burning. Others went days without water, their lips cracking, their bodies trembling from dehydration. Aldrin watched them march. He carried a flask in his breastplate, but gave nothing to himself. He had learned long ago that survival was a knife edge. Give too much, and all fall. The sun was pale, a dim smear behind the clouds, casting long, unreal shadows across the plateau. The cold was constant. Fingers stiffened inside gloves, faces became masks of frost. Every man's breath was visible, hanging like smoke, a fragile proof of life. The march became a torment of the mind as well as the body. Men began to see things, shapes in the wind, faces in the snowdrifts, whispers in the roar of the gusts. Aldrin's own vision wavered at times. He heard the cries of men long dead, smelled smoke where no fire burned, imagined rivers of warm water that dissolved when he tried to approach them. The plateau seemed alive, a cruel consciousness enjoying their suffering. On the 5th day, a soldier named Jaren collapsed, hallucinating a meadow full of children playing. He begged Aldrin to let him join them. When Aldrin shook him, he screamed and thrashed until frostbite claimed his fingers. The man froze in place, staring at nothing, eyes wide and unblinking. Other soldiers followed his example. One by one, their minds frayed under the monotony of gray, the starvation, the cold, and the unending wind.
Aldrin saw his own reflection in a frozen pool and barely recognized himself. Hollow eyes, skin gray-white, beard matted with ice, lips cracked, fingers trembling even through gloves. He could not remember the last time he had slept more than an hour without nightmare. The terrain itself betrayed them. Wagons broke on jagged rocks, hidden beneath the snow. Horses slipped into crevices and fell, dragging men with them. Some soldiers fell into hidden fissures and disappeared. The army had no strength to rescue them, no tools to dig them out. By the 7th day, morale had collapsed entirely. Men whispered quietly about returning home, desertion, or death by choice. They no longer talked of glory or relics. The priests cursed, shouted, and prayed, but their words were swallowed by wind. Aldrin knew that the plateau was a test not of sword, but of spirit. One night, as he stumbled toward a half-frozen fire, he found 2 soldiers huddled together, murmuring to each other about their families. Their breath was shallow. One of them, barely alive, reached for Aldrin. "Tell my brother I—" The man's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. Aldrin knelt, fingers frozen, lips numb, and could only cover him with a blanket of snow and move on. This was the plateau's cruelest lesson. No one would survive unscathed, and those who did would carry more than wounds. They would carry ghosts. The march ended when the plateau finally gave way to the distant tree line at the edge of another valley. It looked like salvation. Trees stood thin and gray, snow-laden but solid. The soldiers staggered forward, grateful for shade, for earth that seemed less hostile. But Aldrin, looking back at the plateau, understood the truth. They were not out of the wilderness. They had only survived one layer of it, and it had already taken too much. He clutched his sword tighter. He would need every ounce of strength left to face the next trial, the city of stone, and the betrayals that waited beyond.
The city of stone rose abruptly from the valley like a jagged wound in the earth. Its walls were high, weathered, gray, and unwelcoming, built from massive blocks that had survived countless wars and sieges. Towers jutted skyward, their tops jagged from centuries of neglect, and the gates were flanked by guards whose eyes were sharper than the swords they held. The army approached cautiously. Every step crunching on frozen dirt felt like a betrayal of hope. Soldiers, already gaunt and hollow-eyed from mountains and plateaus, clutched their weapons as if mere iron could protect them from politics, poison, and treachery. Lord Brindle, emboldened by his title, rode ahead with a small retinue. He expected the city's rulers to tremble at the banners of the north. Aldrin marched silently, sensing the storm beneath the polished stone and formal greetings. The gates opened slowly. A delegation of the city's elite emerged, cloaked nobles, masked advisors, and 2 priests who mirrored the arrogance of Brindle's own clergy. Their smiles were thin and calculating, revealing teeth that would bite if necessary. Inside the city, the army was offered quarters in a broad courtyard. They were given food, water, and fire, a luxury that made some men laugh nervously, others suspicious. The priests insisted it was divine favor. Aldrin knew better. Nothing was free in politics. The city's ruler, Duke Mulric, greeted Brindle in the Hall of Stone. He was tall, lean, with a hawk-like gaze. He spoke smoothly, words measured, layered with subtle threats. "You come far, and yet, I wonder, do you come for the relic or merely to die in pursuit of honor?" Brindle smiled, his arrogance undimmed. "We come for justice and for what is ours by right." Muldric's eyes glimmered. "Justice is expensive, and by the looks of your men,
perhaps unaffordable. Aldrin observed the room. Guards lined every wall. Archers were stationed above. The air was thick with suspicion. Every servant bowed, but their eyes scanned the army like vultures measuring the weak. He recognized it immediately. This was not a city of allies. It was a trap waiting to close. Negotiations dragged for days. Promises were made, favors exchanged. Brindle believed diplomacy could shield them. Aldrin disagreed. Every smile from Malric's court was a sharpened blade behind velvet. Then came the ambush. At dusk, while a small detachment was sent to collect supplies, hidden gates in the walls opened. Soldiers armed with crossbows emerged, cutting down men in the streets. Fire arrows set wagons alight. Chaos exploded. Aldrin ran toward the sounds, steel ready, mud freezing to his boots. The streets reeked of smoke, blood, and fear. Soldiers screamed, some thrown into walls, others hacked down in groups. The city itself seemed alive, feeding on the terror. Brindle realized too late that they had been betrayed by one of the Southern allies he had trusted blindly. A faction within the city sought to weaken the Northern army before it could reach the relic. Aldrin fought through the narrow alleys, rallying small groups of survivors, dragging wounded men into cover. He witnessed close friends die beneath falling stones, crossbow bolts piercing through the weak points in armor. By nightfall, the army had been forced to retreat to the outer walls. Horses were gone, supplies looted, fires burned unchecked. Aldrin stood on the battlements, frost biting his face, watching the city of stone in the moonlight. He could still hear screams carried on the wind. He thought of the mountains behind them, the plateau they had survived, and realized the truth. The land, the cold, and hunger were one enemy, but men and cities could be far worse. Brindle, dazed, muttered about honor and vengeance. Aldrin shook his head. This is not honor. This is survival, and barely that. The city of stone had revealed its lesson. Politics and betrayal could wound deeper than any sword, and even victory was a fragile illusion. The army, broken and weary, prepared to leave at dawn. Many men would not march again, not from death, but from despair. Those who survived knew the road ahead would demand more than courage. It would demand an understanding that the world was indifferent, and that every step forward might be their last. Aldrin clutched his sword and watched the stone walls recede behind them. The war was only beginning, and yet the cost had already been immeasurable. The city of Karam rose abruptly from the plains, a sprawling fortress of brick and stone, ringed by walls thick enough to resist a battering ram for months. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, but the air was heavy with the odor of war, ash, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of blood from skirmishes already fought along its outskirts. The army had been reduced to less than half of its original strength. Men moved slowly, dragging weapons too heavy for their emaciated bodies. Horses, if still alive, were weak and trembling. Hunger etched every face into a mask of hollow despair. Aldrin surveyed the walls from the valley below. Siege engines had been assembled in haste, rickety towers of wood that groaned under their own weight. Engineers and carpenters, hands numb from cold, hammered without pause, driven more by fear than discipline. He walked among his battalion, checking armor, calming panicked soldiers. Many were so thin their ribs protruded sharply beneath worn gambesons. Their mouths cracked, lips gray, eyes sunken. "This is Karam," he said quietly, "and it will not yield easily." The men nodded, but few believed him. The first assault began at dawn. Battering rams smashed against the gates, but defenders poured boiling oil and scalding water down from the walls.
Archers picked off soldiers with deadly precision. Men fell in the mud, impaled on spikes hidden beneath snow. Inside, the streets were narrow, twisted, and full of obstacles. Even those who breached the gates found themselves trapped between barricades, burning debris, and constant attacks from rooftops. Uldren fought through the chaos, sword flashing, armor dented, lungs burning, the screams of men, women, and children intertwined in a single harrowing chorus. Every fallen comrade was immediately replaced by another casualty, an endless tide of death. Hunger and thirst compounded the misery. Soldiers scavenged what little food remained in wagons abandoned at the edge of the city. Water from wells was brackish and half-frozen. Men fought over scraps of bread, tearing at each other in desperation. One soldier, delirious from starvation, lunged at Uldren, mistaking him for a thief. Uldren disarmed him gently, but could not conceal the growing despair in his eyes. These were men who had marched for glory, now reduced to scavenging corpses and biting cold. The siege lasted days. Each night, fires consumed houses, sending plumes of smoke into the sky. The streets ran red with blood and mud. Civilians hid wherever they could. Some dragged into basements and cellars. Others were caught in the crossfire, screaming as walls collapsed around them. Uldren saw a child frozen near the gate, her eyes wide with terror. He carried her to the outskirts, but the parents had already died. He wrapped her in his cloak and pressed on, ignoring the weight of her small body. Survival demanded focus, not sentiment. By the 7th day, the Northern Army could advance no further. The gates had not yielded, the city's defenders remained unbroken, and the cost in men had been catastrophic. Morale plummeted. Mutters of retreat began, whispered in fear, sometimes in defiance. Uldren climbed the walls at night, watching the city glow with firelight, and thinking of the countless lives lost for a campaign that promised glory but delivered only death. Brindle still spoke of honor. The priests still invoked divine blessing. Uldren shook his head. Honor, he realized, was a luxury for those who survived. For the soldiers, for the innocents caught in the streets, it was meaningless. At dusk on the final day, Uldren ordered the retreat. Soldiers stumbled through the narrow alleys, dragging the wounded, leaving behind weapons, siege towers, and the bodies of the fallen. The city's walls loomed over them like a silent accusation. As they left, Uldren glimpsed the city's people watching from the remnants of their homes, faces etched with horror and hatred. The army had not conquered Karam. It had only passed through, leaving death in its wake. And Uldren understood fully. Every victory they hoped for would come at an unpayable price, and every step forward carried with it the echo of countless failures.
The aftermath of Karam left the Northern Army reeling. Soldiers marched with hollow eyes, dragging limbs stiffened by frost and hunger. Horses that remained were gaunt and trembling. Morale was a frayed thread stretched thin over weeks of loss, blood, and exhaustion. Yet Lord Brindle demanded progress. The relic still awaited, somewhere in the southern lands, and he refused to concede that the army was broken. Orders were shouted, wagons were pressed forward, fires were lit to signal resolve, but resolve could not fill stomachs or heal frostbitten flesh. By the 2nd day after leaving Karam, the army arrived at a cluster of villages. They were sparsely populated, some abandoned, some still clinging to life. Brindle saw opportunity, a chance to replenish supplies. Uldren saw desperation, a chance for atrocities. The soldiers looted what they could: grain, salted meat, livestock. They demanded labor from peasants, punishing those who refused. Fire swept through a barn when a torch fell, consuming not only provisions, but animals and the life of the farmer who had tried to save them. Aldrin walked among the villages in disbelief. Smoke curled into the gray sky. Children screamed. Elders wailed. He had seen death and war before, but the deliberate suffering inflicted upon innocents by men who had once been comrades sickened him. Arguments broke out among officers. Some argued that the army needed the food, that survival justified acts that had once been unthinkable. Others protested the cruelty, whispering that Brindell's orders were madness. The priests proclaimed divine blessing upon the spoils, offering prayers as if the suffering were holy. Aldrin could not stomach their words. Faith was no shield against hunger, fire, and steel. As the army pushed further south, villages burned behind them. Smoke painted the horizon orange against the winter sky. Farmers fled to forests and hills, leaving the army with only fleeting targets to plunder. Resistance became common. Traps were set in narrow roads. Archers ambushed scouts. Entire squads disappeared overnight, leaving only abandoned weapons and frozen footprints. The army's numbers dwindled. Hunger gnawed deeper. Men turned on each other for scraps. Fists and daggers found old rivals, settling petty grievances in the shadow of desperation. Aldrin tried to maintain discipline, but the chain of command was breaking. One evening, after a particularly brutal raid, Aldrin confronted Brindell. "Look at what we've become." His voice was hoarse, fingers frozen from handling a sword in the cold. "We are killing those who cannot fight us. We are feeding death, not honor. This is no campaign, it's a massacre." Brindell, face red with anger and fatigue, snapped, "We are at war. The relic is ours by right. If we do not take what is necessary, we will fail." Aldrin's eyes were icy. "And if we succeed, at what cost? You will have nothing left but corpses and ash. Nothing will remember us as heroes, only as monsters." Brindell turned away, muttering about divine will. Aldrin clenched his teeth, knowing he would obey orders, but only so long as survival remained possible. That night, the Northern Army camped among the ruins of another village. Fires flickered weakly. Wolves circled at the edge of the tree line. The men whispered quietly among themselves about families, home, the lives they might have lived. Some no longer whispered at all. They had fallen into a silence deeper than exhaustion. Aldrin walked the perimeter, watching shadows shift in the firelight. He carried memories of Karome, of Heartfall, of the borderlands, of the mountains. Each memory was a wound, stitched together by frost and blood. He realized a painful truth. The campaign was no longer about reclaiming a relic, or honor, or glory. It was about surviving. Nothing else mattered. And the fires burning across the kingdom below were proof. The retreat began, not with ceremony, but with a quiet understanding. The army was no longer marching toward victory, it was marching to survive. The roads southward were littered with the remnants of burned villages, broken wagons, and abandoned corpses. Horses limped through mud and ice, their ribs sharp beneath sagging flanks. Soldiers trudged in silence, every step a battle against exhaustion and despair. The wind cut like blades, carrying the stench of decay, smoke, and blood. Ambushes became frequent. The southern kingdoms had learned their lesson from Karome. Small units of archers, raiders, and hidden soldiers harassed the northern army relentlessly. Aldrin watched men fall, one by one, some screaming, some silently, some begging to be left behind. Each loss was a knife twisting deeper into the morale of those still alive. The wounded, already half dead from frostbite and hunger, could barely walk. Many collapsed and were abandoned to the snow. Others were dragged painfully along, moaning as the cold seeped into every bone. Mutiny simmered among the ranks. Soldiers whispered of desertion. Some tried to flee into forests and hills, only to be captured by officers or swept away by wolves. Arguments erupted over rations, over pace, over the morality of the campaign. Aldrin spent long hours quelling disputes, pulling men back from the brink, his voice sharp, his sword ready, but even he could feel the fraying of order. One night, a group of men refused to continue. They had eaten nothing for 3 days, and the cold had burned their hope to ash. Aldrin confronted them at the edge of a frozen river. "Move or die here," he commanded. One man spat in his face. "Better to die free than march for nothing." Aldrin gritted his teeth, gripping his sword. He had no choice. He struck the man, not to kill, only to enforce obedience. The others followed reluctantly, silent, eyes hollow. The cold was relentless. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears. Men huddled together for warmth, but the wind snatched heat from every embrace. Snow drifted into faces, freezing eyelashes and whiskers, blinding the weary. Water was scarce. Any snow or ice eaten caused stomach cramps and further weakness. Hunger had become an ache, constant and gnawing. Soldiers chewed leather straps, ate frozen roots, and drank snow water without hope. Morale sank lower than it had ever been. Aldrin's thoughts drifted constantly to Brindle. The Lord had grown silent, pacing in his tent like a predator weakened by frost. The arrogance that had launched the campaign now looked fragile and small. Aldrin understood something that night. A leader's failure is measured not by strategy alone, but by the lives destroyed in its wake. And Brindle's failures had left hundreds of men on the brink of collapse. The Northern Army reached a narrow mountain pass, a familiar, cruel echo of earlier horrors. Wolves watched silently from the cliffs, waiting for stragglers. Avalanches threatened. The wounded could barely step forward. By the final day of retreat, only a fraction of the original army remained. Men shuffled forward, eyes vacant, lips blue, fingers numb, weapons slipping from frozen hands. Aldrin led the column. He had lost count of the dead. He had lost count of hope. The retreat was no longer an act of strategy. It was a march of ghosts, dragging themselves southward across a land that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. By the time the Northern Army emerged from the last mountain pass, it was unrecognizable. Once a proud host of thousands, it now numbered only a few hundred ragged souls. Their armor was dented and rusted, cloaks shredded, boots torn, frostbitten, and useless. Faces were hollow, eyes glassy. Voices were whispers. The survivors gathered in a frozen clearing, their banners tattered, flapping limply in the cold wind. Wolves howled in the distance, as if mourning alongside them. Discipline was gone. Officers argued over rations and leadership. Soldiers muttered about desertion. Some accused others of cowardice or theft. Tempers flared, fists and knives found their marks, and Aldrin spent long hours separating brawls, calming men on the edge of madness. Even Brindle, once commanding and imperious, was a shadow of himself. His arrogance had not survived the campaign. His voice trembled when he gave orders, and his eyes no longer inspired obedience. Hunger gnawed relentlessly. Some soldiers licked frost from rocks. Others chewed leather straps softened by boiling water. A few tried to eat raw snow, ignoring the cramps and nausea it caused. Every man was starving. Every man was exhausted. Every man carried grief heavier than his own body. Aldrin rocked among them, counting losses quietly in his head. Heartfall. Hundreds gone, mangled or dead. Mountains. Dozens lost to frost, snow, and avalanches. Plateau. Men vanished in hallucinations, lost to the endless white. Karam. Wounded, dead, or missing. Villages. Countless civilians burned, stolen from, or killed. There was barely a name left to speak without pain. Morale collapsed into silence. Few spoke of glory, few spoke of relics. Some even whispered about abandoning the campaign entirely, retreating home regardless of honor. Aldrin knew the truth. Any notion of victory had vanished long before the last man walked the clearing. Despair also brought introspection. Soldiers, once loyal, now questioned everything: their leaders, their faith, the purpose of their suffering. Many confessed fears they had never voiced, crying for families, friends, and lives they could never reclaim. Aldrin listened, silent. He had no comforting words, only truth. The campaign was a catastrophe, and every step forward had cost too much. Even the survivors carried their ghosts. Nightmares stalked them in sleep, hallucinations plagued them awake. Some muttered to invisible figures, others imagined the sounds of distant battle when none existed. The broken host had become more shadow than army. Aldrin realized what the mountains, the plateau, the cities, and the betrayal had done. They had stripped the army of everything but survival. Honor, glory, and divine purpose were illusions too fragile to endure such relentless suffering. The host was broken. The men were broken. Even he, Aldrin, felt the edges of his own spirit fraying. And yet, they marched on, because to stop was death, because the road back was still farther than they could imagine. The last mountain rose before them like a final judgment. Its peaks were jagged, coated in ice and snow that reflected the pale sun like shards of glass. There was no forest, no shelter, no mercy, only rock, wind, and the endless white that had claimed so many already. The survivors numbered barely 200. Horses were gone, wagons abandoned or crushed, and food reduced to scraps no larger than a man's fist. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle against wind that could slice through armor and flesh alike. Aldrin led them upward, sword in hand, eyes scanning for crevices or hidden threats. Every slope was treacherous. Ice sheets covered loose stone. Snowdrifts threatened to swallow men whole. Avalanches had already claimed smaller groups earlier, and the men knew it. One misstep could mean death. One breath too shallow could freeze lungs. They climbed slowly. Some could barely move. Soldiers staggered, slipping and catching themselves on companions. One by one, they fell into exhaustion. Aldrin was constantly helping the weakest, dragging them forward. Some he could not save. A young squire named Levin collapsed near a cliff edge. His eyes were glazed, lips blue. Aldrin tried to pull him back, but the snow beneath them gave way, and Levin fell into the void. The scream echoed like a bell through the frozen valley. No one spoke. Hunger was a constant gnawing pain. Men gnawed on frozen leather and the few remaining scraps of dried meat. Water came only from melting snow, and even that caused stomach cramps. Frostbite spread like a slow disease, blackening fingers, toes, and noses. Aldrin's own hands and face were numb. His breath formed ice on his beard. He did not sleep. He could not. Too many men depended on him for guidance, for sanity, for survival. The final summit loomed. The wind screamed through the ridges, carrying flakes of snow that cut like needles. Visibility dropped. Some soldiers could not see 5 feet ahead. Then came the avalanche. A low rumble, almost imperceptible, then a roar that shook the mountain. A wall of snow and ice thundered down, burying the path and sweeping away men like rag dolls. Aldrin grabbed 2 soldiers and pulled them behind a boulder. Others were not so lucky. He could only watch as bodies disappeared beneath tons of ice. The survivors were reduced again. By nightfall, only Aldrin and a handful of men reached the plateau beyond the mountain. Frostbite had claimed most of their extremities. Hunger had dulled their minds. Every step forward felt heavier than the last. They had survived the mountain, but at the cost of everything else. Friends, soldiers, horses, wagons, hope. Aldrin looked back at the peaks. The mountain had taken nearly everything, yet the campaign demanded more. He realized a terrible truth. Even the relic, the honor, the glory, whatever remained of their mission was meaningless compared to the lives already lost. But the army had no choice. The road demanded they continue, because to stop meant death, not just from cold and hunger, but from the mountains themselves. And so, one step at a time, the survivors marched on, ghosts among the snow, carrying nothing but the memory of those who had fallen and the weight of what remained.
The ruins where the relic lay were perched on a craggy hilltop, half hidden by snowdrifts and jagged stone. A thin mist clung to the cliffs, obscuring paths and concealing crevices. The survivors approached with caution, bodies aching, hands blackened by frost, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The relic, an ancient jewel-encrusted sword, rumored to hold the power to shift kingdoms, rested atop a stone plinth in the center of a ruined temple. Its metal gleamed faintly, catching what little sun penetrated the gray sky. It was beautiful. It was meaningless. Aldrin studied the sword, feeling the weight of the journey pressed into his bones. 200 men had left the Northern Kingdom months ago. Now fewer than 50 remained. Horses were gone, supplies were exhausted, and even the strongest soldiers were reduced to trembling shadows. The cost of obtaining the relic had been incalculable. Brindell stepped forward, eyes wide with triumph. "At last," he whispered, his voice quivering with awe and fatigue, "we have done it!" Aldrin's gaze did not waver. "At what cost, my lord?" he asked quietly. Brindell faltered, unable to answer. Aldrin gestured to the snow-covered bodies of men they had carried here, to the frostbitten fingers and toes lost to the mountain winds, to the haunted eyes of soldiers still alive but broken. "Honor?" Aldrin said. "Glory? We have nothing left to call those names." The relic was untouched by war or snow, but it did not grant comfort. Soldiers whispered in awe, but the words fell hollow. The sword had no power to heal frostbite, to ease hunger, to bring back the dead. Some men, unable to stand the silence, collapsed in tears.
Others sank to the snow and prayed to gods who had remained silent through every avalanche, every ambush, every burned village. Aldrin finally approached the relic. His gloved hands touched the hilt. It was heavier than it appeared, cold as the mountain stones. He felt the history, the violence, the wars it had inspired, and understood one final truth. The relic was not the prize. The journey itself had been the price. Brindle took the sword with trembling hands, holding it aloft. Soldiers cheered weakly, but the celebration was muted, a fragile echo against months of suffering. Aldrin did not cheer. He simply turned to the survivors. "We leave at first light. The journey home is still ahead, and the world does not wait for the broken." Night fell. Fires were lit sparingly. The wind screamed through the ruined temple. The soldiers huddled together, sharing body heat more than camaraderie. They had survived the mountains, the plateau, Kairam, betrayal, hunger, and frost. Yet every breath felt borrowed, every heartbeat a reminder of what had been lost. The relic lay between them, a symbol of victory no one could truly feel. And Aldrin understood it fully. Some victories are measured in survival, not glory. Some prizes are paid for with lives that cannot be restored. Some campaigns end not with triumph, but with ghosts. The relic had been claimed. But the cost, oh, the cost, was beyond reckoning. The journey home was quieter than any march they had taken before. The survivors shuffled through the snow-dusted valleys, weary beyond words, each step heavier than the last. The relic, gleaming coldly atop Brindle's saddle, was a constant reminder of the price paid. No banners flew proudly, no trumpets sounded, only the wind, slicing through tattered cloaks and biting frozen skin, accompanied their slow retreat. Many could not continue. Soldiers collapsed into the snow, too weak to rise. Some lay silently, staring at the sky, eyes glazed with frost or grief. Aldrin ordered small funerals in the snow, dragging rocks to mark graves. There was no ceremony. No priestly prayers could restore what had been lost. He counted the living silently. Fewer than 40 remained of the hundreds who had departed months ago. Brindle was a hollow man. Triumph had no warmth. He clutched the relic as though it could protect him from the emptiness surrounding them, but even he knew it could not. The men he had commanded, the towns they had burned, the comrades who had died, they haunted him as much as any ghost. The priests muttered of divine favor, but Aldrin ignored them. God had not intervened on the mountains, in the plateau, in Kairam, the city of stone, or the villages burned. He did not intervene here. The survivors owed nothing to faith but the truth of their suffering. As they descended the last hills toward the northern kingdom, the air grew warmer. Trees appeared again, brown and leafless. Birds chirped faintly, as if oblivious to the horrors that had passed through. But the men did not cheer. They did not smile. Each step home was measured against every lost life, every frost-bitten limb, every betrayal, every scream. One by one, survivors collapsed into sleep as night fell. Aldrin stayed awake, scanning the horizon. His body ached. His hands and feet were blackened by frost. His face was hollowed by hunger and grief. Yet he kept watch, for there was always the possibility of wolves, of raiders, of the cruelty of a world that had not yet finished testing them. He thought of the mountains, the plateau, Kairam, the city of stone, and the villages burned. He thought of the soldiers who had trusted him, who had followed him, who had died because he had followed orders. He felt the weight of leadership like a stone on his chest, heavier than the relic itself. At last, the gates of the Northern Kingdom appeared. Smoke rose from chimneys. Soldiers and citizens alike looked at the ragged survivors with awe and confusion. Few could comprehend what they had endured. Few could imagine the losses suffered in pursuit of a goal that now seemed hollow. Brindle dismounted, holding the relic high. Citizens cheered faintly. Soldiers shakily saluted. But Aldrin saw only faces shadowed by loss. He sheathed his sword and walked quietly through the gates. The campaign was over. The relic was claimed. The army had returned, but the world they returned to was not the one they had left. Every man alive carried scars, some visible, many invisible. Every homecoming would be haunted by memories of frost, blood, betrayal, and death. The victories were hollow, the losses innumerable. And Aldrin knew, as he walked through the streets of his kingdom, that the true cost of war was not measured in banners or relics, but in the shattered souls who survived it.
Years passed, but the scars of the Northern Campaign never healed. The land returned to peace, the villages rebuilt, the snow melted from the mountains, and the winds calmed. But the memories of those who marched through frost, fire, and blood remained. Aldrin survived, though he was no longer the man who had led men through mountains, plateaus, and sieges. His hair had grayed, his hands bore the permanent marks of frostbite, and his eyes carried the weight of countless ghosts. He became a teacher of strategy, a counselor in the king's court, but he never raised an army again. He preferred quiet walks through forests and rivers, haunted by the faces of soldiers who had trusted him and never returned. Brindle clutched the relic until his death, but it brought him no peace, no honor that mattered. The nobles whispered behind him, calling him the lord who had burned villages and lost more men than he could count. The relic became a symbol not of victory, but of hubris, a warning to future generations that ambition untempered by wisdom brings ruin. Brindle lived long enough to see every surviving soldier return, each carrying stories of horror he could not undo. The surviving soldiers returned to their homes broken in body and spirit. Many could not farm, fight, or marry. They spoke little of the campaign, but when they did, they spoke in whispers of avalanches, frostbite, starvation, betrayal, and the endless white plateau that had claimed friends and sanity alike. Villagers regarded them with awe, but also fear. They were living reminders that war leaves more than scars on the land. It leaves shadows on the soul. The kingdom itself had changed. Tales of burned villages, massacres, and the decimation of an army spread through the courts and markets. Some called the campaign folly. Others called it heroism. In truth, it was both. Ambition had sought glory, but the cost was immeasurable. The relic remained, locked away in a stone vault. Scholars studied it, priests blessed it, nobles coveted it, but none who held it would ever know the suffering required to claim it. Its true power, Aldrin realized, was not in magic or wealth, but in the lesson etched in blood and snow. No prize is worth the destruction of humanity. And Aldrin, one evening, stood on a cliff overlooking the mountains he had survived. The wind carried whispers of the past, and the sun reflected off the frozen peaks like shards of broken memory. He closed his eyes, listening to the echoes of the fallen. In that silence, he understood.
The campaign had ended, but the shadows remained. They would never leave. And perhaps in the end, that was the truest victory of all. Survival itself, bitter though it was, against a world indifferent to men, armies, or ambition. The Northern campaign had ended, but its ghosts would never march home.